On October 16th, 1859, all was not quiet in Harpers Ferry, Virginia. On this night, a pack of belligerent raiders attacked the arsenal there, determined to arm themselves for a rebellion that would take down any soul who stood in their way. The townspeople sprang into action to protect themselves, to protect their families. These raiders were armed and dangerous. They had taken hostages. They had killed. Soon, a shot was fired, taking down George Turner, who was only there visiting a friend in Harpers Ferry. And the man who fired the shot? Dangerfield Newby, a free black man from Ohio. This simply would not stand. The townspeople attacked with whatever weapons they could muster. Harpers Ferry manufactured guns, but the people had little ammunition. They stuffed their rifles with whatever they could fit into the barrels. For one man, that was 6-inch spikes, and one of those spikes found its mark, striking the throat of Dangerfield Newby and killing him instantly. For over a day, the villain's body lay in the street, desecrated by the angry townspeople whom he had sought to destroy before being unceremoniously dumped into an unmarked mass grave. This was the story of Dangerfield Newby for many years, an intruder, an aggressor, a villain, rightfully taken down by the power of the people who rose up in self-defense. But this is not the full story, because while Dangerfield's body lay in the street, molested by man and beast alike, his pockets were emptied. And in one of those pockets was found a letter, folded and unfolded many times, well read, worn, and possibly even tear-stained. This letter was written by Dangerfield's wife, Harriet. Terrified, pleading. In it, she reveals a completely different side to the story of Dangerfield Newby. Let's fix that. Hello, I'm LaFountaine, and this is History Fix, where I tell surprising true stories from history you won't be able to stop thinking about. This week, I have the story of a very dynamic character for you, my favorite type of character. The story of Dangerfield Newby forces us to rethink everything we think we might know about villains. Because for a very long time, he was cast that way. And it's really only in hindsight that we see an entirely different side to the story, that we see justification for his participation in the raid on Harper's Ferry. And it's in hindsight that we see justification for the raid itself. What was viewed for so long as a brutal attack was actually a necessary action needed to spur a country into correcting a great evil. So let's get started, shall we? If you've ever seen the Quentin Tarantino movie Django Unchained, you should know that the character of Django is at least loosely based on Dangerfield Newby. In the movie, set just before the Civil War, Django teams up with a German bounty hunter, a white guy, who frees him. And then together, they travel around the American South, taking out notorious criminals because they're bounty hunters, right? And this work eventually leads them to the plantation of a notoriously evil enslaver named Calvin Candy, who's played by Leonardo DiCaprio. And it's there on that plantation that Django discovers his wife enslaved. He had been separated from his wife some time ago, as was common for a lot of enslaved people, and he sort of rediscovers her here in this really horrible place. So Django makes it his mission from then on to rescue his wife from this terrible man, at all costs. So keeping that in mind, now let me tell you the story, the true story of Dangerfield Newby. Dangerfield, you see that I almost said Django. It's like the name's even similar. Dangerfield. Dangerfield was born enslaved in Culpeper County, Virginia, around 1820. Of course, we don't know the exact date, because these sorts of records were not kept for Black people at the time. His father was a white landowner named Henry Newby, we know, and his mother, whose name was Elsie, was enslaved. But she was not enslaved by Henry Newby. She was enslaved by his neighbor, a guy named John Fox. But John Fox was pretty laissez-faire about things, I guess, because he allowed Elsie to live with Henry, and together they had several children. Actually, several is kind of an understatement. Some records indicate that they had as many as 11 children together, the oldest of whom, the oldest child, was Dangerfield. Now, it was illegal in Virginia for Henry and Elsie to get married because interracial marriage was not allowed. And also probably because she was enslaved by another man. But they lived as if they were married. Later, Henry moved Elsie and all of their children to Bridgeport, Ohio, where there was no slavery, effectively freeing them. And John Fox, who actually enslaved them, apparently never attempted to reclaim them. I told you, laissez-faire. But as the oldest of 11 children, Dangerfield was already grown when he moved with his family to Ohio, and he was already married with 7 young children of his own. These guys are very fertile. Unfortunately, however, he could not take his wife and children with him. His wife, Harriet, was enslaved by another guy named Jesse Jennings back in Virginia. And I guess Jennings was not as laissez-faire as John Fox. He wasn't having it, right? And then the children stayed with the mother, so his children are also enslaved by this Jennings guy. So Dangerfield moved to Ohio, became a free man, but his wife and his 7 children still enslaved back in Virginia. Okay, that's where we're at. His plan immediately, of course, from the start as a free man now is to work to earn enough money to purchase their freedom. He works as a blacksmith in Ohio, and he's also known to beg for money on the streets in an attempt to raise the funds. And I know that has a bad connotation, like begging for money on the streets, but this man is asking people to help him free his wife and children. So it's like, in that case, yes, please beg for money on the streets, right? This attempt to raise this money was ultimately unsuccessful. And there are 2 different accounts of why this fails, though. According to one, Jesse Jennings, his wife's enslaver, had agreed to sell his family to him for $1,500, which would be something like $60,000 today. But once Dangerfield had acquired the money, Jennings raised the price. Went back on the deal and was now wanting more money. Another account says that Jennings agreed to sell them for $1,000, but that Dangerfield was only able to raise $742, which was only enough to purchase his wife and his youngest child. So this would have left the other 6 children in captivity and without their mother, which they were unwilling to do, of course. I don't know which of those is correct, but either way, despite working, nonstop to save the money to purchase his family, despite desperately trying to do it in the air quotes right way, because in reality, nothing about this situation is right, Dangerfield was unsuccessful. Meanwhile, he is getting letters from his wife, Harriet, that are becoming increasingly more dire. So before we get into those letters, I just want to point out the fact that both Dangerfield and Harriet were literate, could read and write, is incredibly rare. At the time, which we're in the 1850s here, in case I failed to tell you that, right before the Civil War, at that time, it was illegal in Virginia for Black people to learn to read and write. So I'm not sure how they learned. I can only theorize. We know Dangerfield's father, Henry Newby, was white, and he was obviously at least a little sympathetic towards his enslaved children, since he moved them to Ohio and freed them. It's possible that he taught Dangerfield to read and write. It's likely that he taught him how to read and write. As for Harriet, she was enslaved on another plantation. Maybe Dangerfield taught her. We really don't know. But it's very remarkable that they could read and write, and so incredible that we have some of Harriet's letters. We have this paper trail that almost universally does not exist for enslaved people in the 1850s. And these letters shed a lot of light on the situation. They start out harmless enough, just Harriet keeping Dangerfield informed of what's happening in her world. But you'll see that the tone soon starts to shift. Here, I'm going to read you 3 letters. These are 3 letters written by Harriet Newbie to her husband. The first letter is dated April 11th, 1859. She writes, quote, "Dear husband, I must now write you apology for not writing you before this, but I know you will excuse me when tell you Mrs. Jennings has been very sick. She has a baby, a little girl, been a great sufferer, her breast raised, and she has had it lanced, and I have had to stay with her day and night. So I had no time to write, but she is now better, and one of her own servant is now sick, and I am well. That is the greatest importance to you. I have no news to write you, only the children are all well. I want to see you very much, but are looking forward to the promised time of your coming. Oh, dear Dangerfield, come this fall without fail, money or no money. I want to see you so much. That is one bright hope I have before me, nothing more at present. But remain your affectionate wife, Harriet Newbie." End quote. 11 days later, on April 22nd, she writes again a similar letter, mostly just updates. She writes, quote, "I received your letter today, and it give much pleasure to hear from you, but was sorry to hear of your sickness. Hope you may be well when you receive this. I wrote to you several weeks ago and directed my letter to Bridgeport, but I fear you did not receive it, as you said nothing about it in yours, and must give my love to Brother Gabriel and tell him I would like to see him very much. I wrote in my last letter that Miss Virginia had a baby, a little girl. I had to nurse her day and night. Dear Dangerfield, you cannot imagine how much I want to see you. Come as soon as you can, for nothing would give me more pleasure than to see you. It is the greatest comfort I have, is thinking of the promised time when you will be here. Oh, that blessed hour when I shall see you once more. My baby commenced to crawl today. It is very delicate. Nothing more at present, but remain your affectionate wife, Harriet Newbie." End quote. Her final letter that we know of is dated August 16th, 1859. So quite a few months have passed here. The first 2 were in April. This one was in August. This is also exactly 2 months before the failed raid on the arsenal at Harpers Ferry. 2 months before that. Harriet writes, quote, "Dear husband, your kind letter came duly to hand, and it gave me much pleasure to hear from you, and especially to hear you are better of your rheumatism, and hope when I hear from you again, you may be entirely well. I want you to buy me as soon as possible, for if you do not get me, somebody else will. The servants are very disagreeable. They do all they can to set my mistress against me. Dear husband, you not the trouble I see the last 2 years has been like a troubled dream to me. It is said master is in want of money. If so, I know not what time he may sell me, and then all my bright hopes of the future are blasted, for there has been one bright hope to cheer me in all my troubles, that is to be with you. For if I thought I should never see you, this earth would have no charms for me. Do all you can for me, which I have no doubt you will. I want to see you so much. The children are all well. The baby cannot walk yet, but it can step around anything by holding on. It is very much like Agnes. I must bring my letter to close, as I have no news to write you. Must write soon and say when you think you can come. Your affectionate wife, Harriet Newbie." End quote. Okay. So it's here in this last letter where we see a very definite shift in Harriet's tone. The first 2, it's, such and such had a baby. I had to nurse the baby. Somebody was sick. I can't wait to see you. And this one, things are getting dire. She talks about the servants trying to set her mistress against her. Her mistress, Mrs. Jennings, who was very sick and whom she had to stay beside day and night, nursing her back to health and nursing the new baby. That Mrs. Jennings. I don't know what the servants are telling her, but Harriet is under the impression that Mrs. Jennings is turning against her, despite all of what she's done for her. She also says that, quote, master is in want of money. So she fears that he will soon sell her to get that money. And so she worries, of course, that if she is sold to another plantation elsewhere because Mrs. Jennings is dissatisfied with her and Mr. Jennings is in want of money, then A, she will be separated from her 7 children, possibly, the youngest of whom is not yet walking. And B, Dangerfield may not be able to purchase her freedom or even find her to begin with, right? So he had this agreement with Jennings, right, to purchase her, not whoever she ends up being sold to. So she's pleading with him in this letter. Time is running out. They're going to sell me soon. You have to come get me now. Dangerfield gets this. He reads this. I imagine his heart just sinks because there is nothing he can do. He doesn't have the money, right? Jennings will not sell them for the amount that he has for whatever reason. I mean, can you imagine? Can you imagine this for a sec? Can you put yourself in his shoes, in Harriet's shoes? This is an absolute nightmare that no human should ever have to endure. This world, this way of living, it cannot go on. It cannot. And it won't for much longer because for many, with their eyes open, these horrors have now been fully realized. For abolitionists all over the country, the time for action is fast approaching. This isn't just going to fizzle out. The government isn't doing anything. Action will be required on the part of the people, likely violent action at that. These were the views, at least, of abolitionist John Brown, who also happened to live in Ohio, like Dangerfield Newby. John Brown was white. He was born in Connecticut in 1800, which makes him about 20 years older than Dangerfield. But as a child, his family moved to Hudson, Ohio. Their family home in Hudson was an important stop on the Underground Railroad. There, his father, Owen Brown, worked tirelessly to help freedom seekers escape from slavery, offering their family home as a safe house to harbor fugitives. So even as a young child, this was John Brown's reality. His family helped people get to freedom. And so naturally, as an adult, Brown became an abolitionist. He believed slavery was evil and that it had to end. In 1837, he attended an abolition meeting in Cleveland and was so moved by it and by the recent murder of anti-slavery activist Elijah P. Lovejoy that he publicly announced his dedication to destroying the institution of slavery, saying, quote, "Here before God, in the presence of these witnesses, from this time I consecrate my life to the destruction of slavery," end quote. But Brown was not a pacifist like some abolitionists were. He believed that slavery would only fall through violence. In 1855, he was called to act on this promise that he had made, consecrating his life here. 2 of his sons had moved to settle in the Western Territory that would eventually become the state of Kansas. They'd started families there. They're trying to settle in and start a life here in the future state of Kansas. But they soon wrote to their father for help. Many people were settling near them who were pro-slavery, and they were worried that when it came time to become a state, Kansas would enter into the Union as yet another slave state. They were determined that it should not be a slave state, that it should be a free state. And so they summoned their father to help them prevent this from happening. And violence between pro-slavery and anti-slavery settlers soon erupted in Kansas. 2 of Brown's sons were captured. A third was killed by pro-slavery forces. But he didn't give up their cause. He traveled around the country raising money and obtaining weapons to keep fighting. And in the end, their efforts were successful. Kansas voted to become a free state in 1858. So, one battle had already been won in Kansas, but there were many, many more to fight in the pursuit of freedom. By early 1859, Brown began leading raids, mostly in the Midwest, to free enslaved people. So the idea here of a raid is that you steal weapons, you arm the enslaved people, which allows them to essentially bust out of slavery, right? We know that John Brown met both Harriet Tubman, whom he called General Tubman, and Frederick Douglass. And for the most part, they supported his ideology and they inspired him, to keep up this fight against slavery. Harriet Tubman actually helped John Brown plan the attack on the Harpers Ferry arsenal, although Frederick Douglass vehemently opposed this plan. So what was the plan? The plan was to attack the U.S. military arsenal there in Harpers Ferry, where a bunch of weapons were kept, and then use those weapons to start a rebellion where they would attack enslavers and free the people that they enslaved. Brown recruited 22 men to help him with this raid, including his 2 surviving sons, and 5 of the 22 men were also free Black men. One of those free Black men was, you guessed it, Dangerfield Newby. And I have to imagine that, after failing to raise the money to rescue his family in time, and with time clearly running out, according to the letter from his wife, Dangerfield was forced to pivot to a new plan. If he can't buy her, he will take her by force. This John Brown guy is trying to take down enslavers and free enslaved people in Virginia. This is exactly what Dangerfield needs. If he helps Brown, and if they are successful, there is a chance he will be able to rescue his family. So this all goes down on October 16th, 1859. The men split up. Some of the men, led by John Brown's son, Owen Brown, go to the estate of Colonel Lewis Washington, who was a distant relative of George Washington, actually, the George Washington, and a notorious enslaver. They capture him. They take him hostage. And then the rest of the men, led by John Brown, go to capture the armory, to seize the weapons to use in this rebellion that they're hoping to stage. So this whole plan hinges on seizing the weapons before officials in Washington, D.C. can be notified, because this is a military arsenal, right? So if D.C. finds out, they're sending in the military to put a stop to this. So the men stop a train that's headed for D.C. to try to keep them from finding out about the raid. But ultimately, Brown lets the train go, and the conductor immediately tells the authorities about what's happening in Harpers Ferry. So I guess that was a mistake. But anyway, during this stopping of the train, the first casualty of this whole ordeal takes place. A baggage handler, a free Black man actually, is shot in the back and killed when he refused to follow the orders of Brown's men. An unfortunate loss, considering this guy, a Black man, was exactly who they were actually trying to help. While the train is on the way to D.C., though, they do manage to capture several white enslavers. But by the end of the day on the 16th, the townspeople had started to fight back, raising a militia. Brown's men capture the armory, but the militia has them surrounded. Dangerfield Newby was the first casualty of Brown's men. He was struck in the neck by a 6-inch spike as he attempted to retreat to the engine house. According to John Eric Gillot, writing for Emerging Civil War, quote, "A witness would recall that Newby's throat was cut literally from ear to ear, remembering the wound as more hideous than he'd seen on any battlefield," end quote. So Dangerfield was killed instantly, but his body remained where it fell in the street for over 24 hours. According to an article in the National Era abolitionist newspaper from October 27th, 1859, his body was, quote, "exposed to every indignity that could be heaped upon it by the excited populace. The treatment the lifeless bodies of those wretched men received from some of the infuriated populace was far from creditable to the actors or to human nature in general. Though dead and gory, vengeance was unsatisfied, and many, as they ran sticks into his wound or beat him with them, wished that he had 1,000 lives, that all of them might be forfeited in expiation and avengement of the foul deed he had committed," end quote. So they are describing the desecration of his corpse, that the townspeople beat his body with sticks and ran sticks into his wound. I read somewhere else that his ears were cut off and kept as souvenirs, because that's totally normal. But then again, we also have in the Baltimore Sun newspaper reporting on the same incident, quote, "No one seemed to notice him particularly, more than any other dead animal," end quote. Which is not much better, honestly, but I don't know, I guess it is. We do know that he was left there for quite some time, though, and there are reports of animals messing with his body as well. According to Joseph Barry in The Strange Story of Harper's Ferry, which was published in 1903, hogs were observed eating the body. I know. Terrible mental image. It's possible that Hog Alley in Harper's Ferry, which is now in West Virginia, by the way. At the time this story takes place, it was Virginia. Now Harper's Ferry is in West Virginia. It's possible that Hog Alley was named because of this incident where the hogs are eating these bodies. Eventually, Dangerfield's body, along with 7 of Brown's other fallen men, were thrown into a packing box and buried in a pit without any kind of ceremony or marker. And then the final 2 out of 10 total men of Brown's men who died were taken to Winchester Medical College and dissected by students there. But let's go back. Let's go back to the moment right before Dangerfield Newby died. You know, what happened? What happened to the rest of the men? So once the townspeople, this sort of local militia, surrounded them, Brown had them retreat to the Armory's engine house, which was like across the street from the Armory. This is when Dangerfield was killed, trying to retreat. The rest of them barricaded themselves in the engine house, which became known as John Brown's Fort. They are surrounded by this militia of townspeople, and there's no escape. Brown actually tries to surrender. He sends his son Watson out to surrender, and they just shoot him. He later died of his injuries. But by the morning of October 18th, so 2 days after this whole ordeal started, President James Buchanan had ordered the military to march to Harper's Ferry, led by future Civil War General Robert E. Lee. Lee tries to get Brown to surrender, but he refuses. And can you blame him? Like, he already tried that. Remember, they shot his son. So he's like, no way, we're not coming out. So the military storms John Brown's fort, this engine house where they're all holed up, and they take Brown and the remaining men alive. John Brown was convicted of treason and murder and a few other things in November and hanged on December 2nd at 59 years old. His execution was witnessed by both Robert E. Lee, who would soon lead the Confederacy in the Civil War, and, I thought this was interesting, and it was witnessed by John Wilkes Booth, an actor who would soon assassinate future President Abraham Lincoln. Before dying, Brown handed the executioner a slip of paper that read, quote, I, John Brown, am now quite certain that the crimes of this guilty land will never be purged away but with blood. End quote. A prophetic statement, really. Although the raid on Harper's Ferry had failed, it inflamed tensions between the North and the South, and it sort of laid bare these irreconcilable issues regarding slavery that were plaguing the country and sort of being swept under the rug. It almost certainly impacted the 1860 presidential election of Abraham Lincoln, and it served as a sort of practice run for the Civil War that would follow a year and a half later. After his execution, John Brown's wife took his body to their family farm in upstate New York and buried him. And then in 1899, 40 years after their deaths, the 8 men who were sort of thrown unceremoniously into that pit in Harper's Ferry, including Dangerfield Newby, their bodies were exhumed and reburied beside Brown in New York. But what about Harriet, right? Dangerfield's wife? Despite her intense longing to see her husband again. Remember, she writes, quote, I want to see you so much. That is one bright hope I have. And, quote, you cannot imagine how much I want to see you. Come as soon as you can, for nothing would give more pleasure than to see you. It is the greatest comfort I have, is thinking of the promised time when you will be here. Oh, that blessed hour when I shall see you once more. And, quote, for there has been one bright hope to cheer me in all my troubles, that is to be with you. For if I thought I should never see you, this earth would have no charms for me. End quote. Tragically, Harriet never saw Dangerfield again. And tragically, just as she feared, she was soon sold south to Louisiana. But I won't leave you with such a sad ending because her story doesn't end there, thankfully. While in Louisiana, she met a man serving in the Union Army from West Virginia named William Robinson. They got married and moved to Virginia, where they raised 3 children together, plus her 7 children from her marriage to Dangerfield. They were able to stay together despite it all. Today, many of Dangerfield and Harriet's descendants still live in the Washington, D.C. area. It's easy to see this group of 22 men as the bad guys, right? They came into this town, Harpers Ferry. They started taking people, prominent people hostage. They captured the armory. They started killing people. They killed the mayor. And the people of Harpers Ferry, they're like, what did we do? We didn't do anything to you guys. Why are you attacking us? Brown's men, Dangerfield Newby, they seemed like the aggressors. And in a lot of ways they were, but you have to look at their motives. Why are they doing this? They aren't doing this to take down Colonel Lewis Washington or the mayor or that black guy on the train platform, right? They're doing this to take down an institution that rips husbands from wives and mothers from their babies. They're doing this for liberty, for freedom, for justice for all. They're doing it for the same reasons General George Washington sneak attacked British forces the day after Christmas. If Washington wasn't an aggressor, a villain, then neither was John Brown and neither was Dangerfield Newby. A man will do a lot of things to protect his family, right? Put yourself in Dangerfield Newby's position for a moment, reading that letter from your wife as she begs you to rescue her, to rescue your children, your baby who can't even walk yet. Folding it up and tucking it into your pocket with a pit in your stomach, knowing full well you've done everything to raise the money and you've come up short. What would you have done? To what end would you go? And does your decision in that unthinkable situation make you a villain or a hero? Thank you all so very much for listening to History Fix. I hope you found this story interesting and maybe you even learned something new. As always, source material for this episode can be found in the show notes. Be sure to follow my Instagram @HistoryFixPodcast to see some images that go along with this episode and to stay on top of new episodes as they drop. I'd also really appreciate it if you would rate and follow History Fix on whatever app you're using to listen and help me spread the word by telling a few friends about it. That'll make it much easier to get your next fix.